In May 1976, a 1-year-old boy was brought to the ASHANTI Goldfields Hospital in Obuasi, burning with fever. His father worked for ASHANTI Goldfields Corporation, and so he was entitled to get treatment there. But it was his worried mother who carried him through the doors, seeking relief for his suffering baby. Little did they know that that moment would change the life of the family forever. A male nurse named GYAN received them in the outpatient department and checked the child's temperature. It read about 38 degrees Celsius. Without consulting a doctor, without running proper tests, and on his own initiative, he grabbed the syringe and injected the infant with chloroquine. It was a gamble based on assumption. The child had fever, and the most common cause of such fever in children then was malaria. Therefore, the injection seemed logical, but the assumptions in medicine can have horrible consequences. 2 days passed, and the fever still persisted. The child was given oral Malarix and multivite, but still, something was terribly wrong. Within 2 weeks, the unthinkable happened. The little boy could no longer crawl. His heel tendon had shortened and contracted, and the devastating truth emerged. The child had developed symptoms consistent with poliomyelitis, and his limb was paralyzed. The hospital attempted to correct their mistake. They performed surgery to elongate the damaged tendon, but even this was so badly done. So bad that the child required further treatment at multiple hospitals, additional surgeries, and endless procedures. The family's bills soared. Their son's future had been sacrificed on the altar of hasty medical judgment. They decided to sue, and they brought an action at the High Court, Kumasi, against the hospital's mother corporation, ASHANTI Goldfields Corporation. They alleged negligence on the part of GYAN, arguing that he failed to follow procedure and that the failure had caused their son's right leg to be paralyzed. They also claimed the expenses incurred and anticipated at north of 94,000 Ghana cedis. When the case reached court, the child's father stood in as the son's witness, although it was his wife who had been there the fateful day. His testimony carried the light weight of hearsay, and perhaps that may have ended their chances. Their case was, however, simple. Polio, when properly diagnosed and treated, often leads to recovery, but when it is not identified and a person is injected, paralysis becomes inevitable. That single injection, meant to heal, had instead condemned their son to paralysis, a result which could have been avoided if certain checks were done by GYAN. They pleaded res ipsa loquitur. To them, the hospital had failed catastrophically, and they demanded answers. At the hospital marshaled an impressive array of medical experts. They called Dr. Safueje, head of child health at Comfort Teaching Hospital, and Dr. Brifansa, chief medical officer at ASHANTI Goldfields Hospital. These distinguished physicians offered a unified defense. They would have done exactly the same thing. In their view, polio tests were difficult to obtain, and malaria was the most common cause of fever in Ghana. It is only at the time of an epidemic of polio that a medical professional would be cautious when treating a fever. But in the scenario Nurse GYAN found himself, he must have been anxious to save the child from the fever, and therefore the nurse's decision to inject him with chloroquine was justified under the circumstances. The court applied the Bolam test, a legal standard that asks not what a reasonable person would do, but what a reasonable professional in that field would do. When special skills are involved, the law recognizes that ordinary people cannot judge professional conduct. The question then becomes, what would a competent person with the same training do in the identical circumstances? The medical expert had spoken with one voice. The injection was justified. The nurse acted within accepted medical practice, and the case was lost. But one judge refused to accept this conclusion. Justice Ofori Boateng dissented with such intellectual force that one wonders why there was no further appeal to the Supreme Court. He posed critical questions. Why wasn't a proper diagnosis done when fever could indicate countless diseases? What gave the nurse authority to diagnose and treat without consulting a physician? Why choose an injection which would have irreversible consequences when oral medication was available, especially knowing that an injection could lead to paralysis if the fever was caused by polio? The dissenting judge noted that even if it was agreed that polio tests were rare to come by, malaria itself could have easily been diagnosed to rule it out conclusively. Perhaps the injection would have been avoided. The decision to inject was too grave, too permanent, and too risky to make without certainty. The plaintiffs had also pleaded res ipsa loquitur, and the hospital had to explain how the child was harmed. In his view, the explanation were lackluster and put further blame on the hospital's leadership. The nurse himself had admitted to having only 4 years of experience. How was such an individual given the freedom to run an entire OPD, diagnose diseases without testing, and without reference to a qualified doctor? In the view of Justice Boateng, their explanations had rendered them equally guilty of negligence. On this basis, Justice Boateng questioned whether the doctors could truly be called a reasonable body of medical men, as required by the Bolam test. To say that Agyemang carried out the accepted practice and so therefore should be excused was completely wrong in his view. The accepted practice in itself was negligent, and therefore it was no defense. Ashanti Goldfields experts were, in his view, disqualified from setting the appropriate standard of care. But nonetheless, the majority ruled in favor of the hospital. But we learn very critical things from this case. Medical professionals, like any professionals, will almost always close ranks to protect each other. That is the danger in the Bolam test. It allows the profession itself to be both the defendant and the judge. The dissent of Justice Ofori Boateng exposed the weakness in relying only on professional consensus, because sometimes the accepted practice is in itself negligent. This case, although it was lost, shows us why bold judges are needed to pierce through the veil of medical solidarity and call out bias and wrongdoing when they see it. For in the end, justice should not bend to the convenience of experts, but it must protect the vulnerable. Follow Super Law GH Studios for more real stories, real cases, real people.